Yeah, this video is just some tips and tricks for your SAC, some really current factors that are going on, but also some things that people have noticed from the SACs that people are having some difficulties with. So first of all, it's really important you're aware of how we're tracking in relation to our goals at the moment. So particularly these first four columns, yes, in essence, real GDP growth well below the target range of 3 to 4%, and has been going down over recent months, and therefore well below at 2.3%. Headline inflation at 1.3%, again, well below our target range of 2 to 3%. Headline inflation, CPI, is really weak at the moment. We're below our goal. Underlying inflation is slightly higher, and that's mainly because the headline inflation rate is impacted more by the lower petrol prices at the moment. So that's caused the headline rate to go down, but because it largely gets removed from underlying, the lower petrol prices have not had as big an impact on underlying inflation. Unemployment rate, we're just inside our range at the moment. However, that figure is a little bit misleading, which we'll talk about in a second, because there's a high rate of underemployment. 8.2% for the underemployment rate. So again, that means a lot of people are not working as much as they would like. And 13.2%, which is just these two plus together, the underutilization rate, underemployed plus unemployed. The last two figures are not as important, but job vacancies are increasing. That's a sign of a stronger labour market because it means that businesses are looking for workers. So they're the key figures you want to be aware of, particularly those first four, when you're quoting what's happening in the Australian economy at the moment. Okay, key things you need to be aware of. As I said, most of these are covered in the last video, but I'll talk about this slide more in particular. You need to be aware and ready for questions that ask you generally factors that are impacting the goals at the moment. So these ones here, these are your demand factors that are causing more growth in employment. The lower dollar is a positive, and low interest rates, even though the banks have slightly increased their interest rates this year, that's generally a positive. Hurting growth is the fall in house prices. Don't say low house prices, say the fall in house prices. House prices are still expensive, they're just not as expensive as they were, and that's made people feel less wealthy and hurt confidence. And weaker overseas growth, you could link. If you're going to choose this one, talk about the fact that the demand for our commodities and the price of commodities has slipped slightly. Supply side benefits, so the slow growth in wages and rising productivity. You could also have lower oil prices in there as well. Negative supply side factors, the slowdown in productivity growth. In terms of things increasing demand pull inflation, you've got the lower dollar and lower interest rates. They're both boosting demand and causing higher prices. These ones are the same as these ones, leading to less demand. And again, the supply side factors are the same as the ones reducing cost push inflation. Okay. So in terms of some key tips and things that I've been seeing in your SACs that perhaps you just need to adjust a little bit, don't say house prices are falling. If you're going to use the reduction in house prices as a negative demand side factor, state that house prices are falling or they've been going down over the last 12 months. They are not low. This is really important. Take particular note of this. When you're doing questions about aggregate demand side factors, there's a clear step-by-step process you need to do for these questions. You need to explain how it's impacting the components of aggregate demand. So, for example, if you're looking at the low exchange rate increases net exports. It can also increase consumption and investment spending. Then the overall impact on aggregate demand. So your components, the overall impact on demand, then link it to production, then link it to employment. If it's a question about employment. If it's about growth, link it to production after aggregate demand. If it's about employment, link it to the same thing, but then components, aggregate demand, higher production. Because of higher production, there's higher employment. You need to do the step-by-step. You need to do those in the correct order when you're doing questions for any demand side factor. When you're getting questions about the relationship between things, so if it's between employment and growth, you need to explain the relationship both ways. So, for example, an increase in employment boosts growth because it leads to higher incomes, leads to higher purchasing power. That leads to increased aggregate demand. Businesses increase production to meet that demand. And the other way around, growth will generally lead to more employment because we're producing more, so we need more workers. However, that's not always the case because sometimes we can use more capital. So that could be like how you round out your answer. This thing here on your practice SAC, I think there's a question in practice SAC 1. This is not being done very well. I've marked about 10 of them and people's definitions are way too complicated and not really right. Okay? If you're getting asked for the difference between annual and annualized inflation, annual inflation looks at price changes for the year. Okay, so it compares to, say, December 2018 to December 2017, where annualized inflation looks at price changes for the quarter and multiplies it by 4. Shouldn't be talking about growth, shouldn't be talking about production, shouldn't be talking about prices for the quarter or something like that. Your language is really important. Annual inflation looks at price increases for the year. Annualized inflation looks at price changes for the quarter and multiplies it by 4. If you're doing it for March 2018, you'd be comparing it to December, then multiplying it by 4. You need to use that language when you're comparing the two. How can we achieve growth alongside low inflation? That's a question that really stems from having an increase in our productive capacity. So when we increase our productive capacity, it allows us to increase growth without experiencing inflationary pressures. Okay? Basically, if we invest in education, in infrastructure, and technology, then we're able to push out our aggregate supply curve, we can meet aggregate demand, and therefore we achieve growth, which is a shift to the right, and when real GDP increases along the x-axis, but it doesn't experience increases in price. Okay, that's another question that hasn't been answered particularly well from the practice SAC. Increases in productive capacity allow for that. Low job vacancies, again, that means the labour market is weak and participation is likely to fall because it's hard to get a job. Full employment and the NIRO. Okay, the NIRO means the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Basically, that means that we want the lowest rate of unemployment possible before it starts to achieve excessive inflation. So that might come about because of higher wages when there's low unemployment, because wages go up when there's low unemployment because there's more demand than supply of labour, and it may also come about through increased spending because more people have got a job. So we want the lowest rate of unemployment without it causing excessive inflation. Okay. And last bit, I'll skip this and talk about this on the next slide. Defining living standards. If you get asked a question on living standards, you need to mention both material and non-material in your definition. So it incorporates material living standards measured by our purchasing power, which is often measured by GDP per capita, and non-material living standards, which are other quality of life factors like crime rates, leisure time, etc., etc. So there's some of the key things. In terms of, this is another really important thing, okay, a really key thing that's in the news a lot at the moment is sort of describing what's going on with the labour market. So at the moment, the labour market, unemployment's at 5%, which is quite low. Okay, if we want 4 to 5%, that's lower than what it's been in the past, but that severely overstates the strength of the labour market. 5% unemployment is no longer really the full employment rate of unemployment, okay, because we need it to be much lower than that now to try and to be what we want to achieve, and that's because there's a lot of underutilisation. So it assumes the labour market is strong, but it's not that strong. It's a lot weaker than what it actually is, implies, because underemployment's still at 8.2%, which means 13.2% of the population are still in the labour force but underutilised. In other words, there's heaps of people that want more hours. This is giving businesses bargaining power to keep wages down, so they've gone up a little bit, but they haven't gone up by much. And the other reason why wages are going up slowly is productivity growth is weak. If we are becoming more productive, then firms are willing to give pay rises, but at the moment we're not really increasing our productivity. So productivity growth is generally associated with wages going up because they can do so and still keep their real unit labour costs down. But at the moment we're not being very productive, so firms are not willing to increase wages. So that's your snapshot of what the labour market's doing at the moment. So in terms of when you're answering questions, this is another question people struggled with, this one here, about how will a cut in interest rates impact the 3 goals, okay, unemployment, price, and economic growth. So basically, an increase in interest rates, the main impact is the demand curve shifting to the right. So you go from here to here. Now, essentially what happens is any increase in aggregate demand, just think of it like micro, leads to an increase in price. and and any movement to the right is likely to lead to more employment and more growth. So this is real GDP, which is your measure of production, but generally an increase in real GDP is also synonymous with more employment. So a cut in interest rates should lead to a rise in economic growth, a fall in unemployment, and an increase in prices. Anything that increases demand will have those 3 impacts. If it shifts the aggregate supply curve, just the aggregate supply curve, so if we go to the right, then the only difference is it would be a rise in economic growth, a fall in unemployment, but a fall in price levels. So, for example, if the question asks you, what's the impact of increased productivity, it would be D, a rise in growth, fall in unemployment, and a fall in price levels. If it's lower real unit labour costs, increased participation, any supply side factor or anything that increases our productive capacity is D. Anything that increases demand is A. So how can a low rate of inflation still exist when economic growth is strong? Basically, strong rates of economic growth can exist if we increase our aggregate supply. If there's an increase in our productive capacity, this will allow us to meet any extra aggregate demand without experiencing inflationary pressures. So the supply of goods and services is able to meet demand, which limits the pressure on prices. Okay, some tricky questions from the past, again, that people have been finding difficult. This one was in the last year's SAC. Explain how real GDP above 3% can have both positive and negative influences on living standards. From a positive perspective, basically more growth means more production. More production means more demand for labour, and if there's more demand for labour, that means less unemployment and more people have jobs, and therefore more purchasing power. Some people are just going straight to higher purchasing power. You need to clearly articulate that production leads to more jobs leads to more purchasing power. That's your benefit. Another benefit might be increased taxation revenue. And your weaknesses are you get given your weaknesses in your definition of strong and sustainable growth. Your weaknesses are that it can lead to excessive inflation if it's demand driven, that it can lead to environmental pressures or hurt the environment. Every time we produce something, we might be cutting down a tree, we might be emitting carbon dioxide. All those things hurt the environment, and therefore is a reason that production has a negative impact on living standards. Okay, that's really what the question's asking you. How does an increase in production hurt living standards? I've talked about this before, so I won't go into that again. I talked about this as well, that when you're comparing annual and annualized rates, annuals for the year, how much prices have gone up, annualized for the quarter. Again, describing demand and supply side factors. These are the kind of questions you need to be ready for. So one aggregate demand and one aggregate supply factor influencing inflation. So it might be the dollar, it might be house prices, it might be real wage growth is another good one. Two factors that account for Australia's low rate of inflation. So again, the really appropriate ones there would be low real wage growth, might be increased participation, or lower oil prices. They're probably the only ones relevant to that question. And the last question is explain how relatively low growth in the wage price index might help to create jobs. Okay, there's a range of things you can talk about for that question, but basically when there's low wage growth, it's the same as any aggregate supply question. It keeps firms' cost of production down. That makes them more willing to supply, which creates jobs, and also makes us more internationally competitive, which creates jobs. The other thing is when wages are down, firms might become more labour intensive because they prefer to hire labour instead of capital because it costs them less. That all creates jobs. So increased aggregate supply, increased international competitiveness, increased willingness to supply, and the fact they might become more labour intensive is all relevant to that question. Okay. In terms of distinguishing how demand and supply factors reduce unemployment, demand side factors boost employment due to its impact on production. Higher demand leads to falling stock levels. Firms will increase their output, and that increases the derived demand for labour. When aggregate supply shifts, it increases firms' willingness or ability to produce, leads to lower prices, which increases the demand for labour, but also makes firms willing to supply. So one's about increased demand and meeting that with increased production. One's about increased willingness to supply, which leads to more jobs. Last couple of things. Strong and weak labour markets, really important that you've got these down pat. In strong labour markets, there's high wage pressures. Essentially what causes that is the demand for labour exceeds supply. So wages go up when unemployment's low because the demand for labour is higher than the supply, and therefore they need to raise wages to try and entice workers. There's high job vacancies, high job advertisements, and these are the opposite. Low wage pressure, supply exceeds demand, limited demand pull inflation, low incomes, low job vacancies. This question people found particularly difficult from the practice SAC. Which of the following is likely to have a big impact on participation is different from the others? A decrease in the rate of unemployment means there's more opportunities, so participation goes up. A decrease in the retirement age means people retire early, participation goes down. An increase in the cost of childcare, participation goes down because it's more costly to put your kids in childcare, so you're less likely to work. And a decrease in job vacancies, this is probably the one that threw people, means that it's harder to get a job because there's not many jobs vacant, and that again decreases participation, which makes A the odd one out. Talked about a couple of these in class. I'm not going to go into them now, but as I said, any question on supply, make sure you've made links to willingness to supply, lower prices, and international competitiveness when you're linking it to any goal. If it's a question on the dollar, make sure you're really clear in linking it to both all the components of demand. So net exports increase because foreign currencies have more purchasing power. It also boosts investment, it boosts consumption. all that leads to demand pull inflation. But it also becomes more expensive to import, which costs